So in this video, we're going to start our discussion of the history of the English language. In some ways, we really started it when we talked about Proto-Indo-European because that's the furthest ancestor, traceable ancestor of English. But really, we're now going to start with when English proper develops and look at its history from there. English arises in England, and England is a region of Great Britain, which is the large island that contains Wales, England, and Scotland, if you're not familiar with your geography for that part of the world. And so this is where English is first spoken. But I want to note that that is not the native language there. This is a language that doesn't really evolve until about 500 AD. So I want to start by thinking about what was spoken there before and how does English get started, right? What historical factors lead to this? So on the island of Great Britain, there were people who had been living there for thousands of years, speaking some kind of language that was never recorded and that we cannot possibly know today. And then sometime in the first millennium BC, we get the migration of some people from the Indo-European language family, people who spoke languages from the Indo-European language family, moving into Britain and settling there, and their culture really spreading. And so the language that grows there is known as the Celtic, I should say, the group of languages, the subfamily, are the Celtic languages. And so Irish and the early forms of the early languages spoken in Britain, Welsh, Scottish, right? These are all Celtic languages. And so the Celtic languages were spoken there for quite a time. Now, it's true that in the mid-1st century AD, Rome conquers Britain, right? So this includes England and Wales. They don't actually get up to Scotland. So Rome comes in and conquers it, makes it a province of the Roman Empire. But this doesn't mean that the Roman language, that Latin, replaces the Celtic languages the way that Celtic languages replace the earlier ones. Actually, Latin doesn't make a huge dent linguistically in Britain. And so why is this? Well, we talked about the spread of the Latin language before, and we said that you weren't required to learn Latin if you lived in the Roman Empire, right? If Rome conquers you and rules over you, you don't have to learn Latin. But the upper class will often learn Latin because it helps them engage in the sort of social, political, economic spheres of the Romans, and it helps them to get ahead. But for most people, they're just farmers living in the countryside. They're never going to bother to learn it. So yeah, most people living in Britain, even after Roman conquest, continue to speak some kind of Celtic language. The upper class uses Latin, and Latin's used for official documents, but most everyone is just speaking a Celtic language. And the Roman rule lasts for a few centuries, but then it disappears, right? The Romans begin to suffer a series of problems that weaken the Roman Empire, especially the Western Roman Empire. And by the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire is in pretty serious decline, to the point that in 410 AD, Rome just withdraws from Britain. It gives it up. It says, you're on your own, right? You're not under our rule anymore. We can't possibly keep up with that. It's too far away. We can't possibly keep sending politicians and soldiers and everything, so you're on your own. And so the Romans officially withdraw. And they would simply sort of revert to sort of whatever they had before, and people who had been speaking Celtic will just continue to speak the Celtic languages. Now, at this point, in theory, they're free, but that freedom only lasts for a little while, because by 450 AD, they are conquered again, right? And this time by people coming from Germany. So in Germany, there are another group of people who spoke a Indo-European language. The ones that arrive here sometime in the mid-1st millennium BC begin to speak a language called Proto-Germanic, which is the parent of the Germanic languages. And we've talked before about how Proto-Germanic breaks up into 3 branches: an eastern branch, a northern branch, and a western branch. And it just follows those who settle more in the eastern parts, those who go up to Scandinavia, like Norway and Sweden, and those who settle more in the western parts of Germany. So among those more westerly tribes are Angles and Saxons, right? And so they speak some kind of West Germanic language. And it is these two tribes who, around 450 AD, invade and conquer England, right, the region of England, and establish a series of kingdoms there. where they rule. Now, why did they invade? Possibly it's because there was some trouble back home. There are a lot of migrations going on in this period and new groups moving in, and so their land may have been threatened. The Huns, for instance, think of like Attila the Hun, they were on the move. So they may have been moving to England to find a safer place to live. But whatever the reason was, around 450 AD, they move into England, they conquer it, and they build their own kingdoms there. And this is a time of what is known as the Anglo-Saxon culture, which they establish with their rule in England. Okay, so despite the fact that Britain has seen some language that was used before Proto-Indo-European speakers came, and then the Celtic languages and a smattering of Latin, it is really English then which grows here starting around 450, 500 AD, and which will dominate up through now. Okay, so this first period of the early English language lasts from about 450 to 650 AD. And this is often called prehistoric Old English. It is the most early form of English, and it is a kind of a formative period of transitioning from whatever West Germanic language the Angles and Saxons were speaking to the true form of Old English as it becomes. But it's unattested. There are no documents written in this 200-year period that survive, possibly no documents written at all. And so we can't really study it, we can't really talk about it and its features. And then around 650 AD, we see the beginning of the Old English period proper. Right? It has now reached some kind of form, and it will maintain that form more or less for the next few hundred years. We tend to say Old English goes up to about the mid-11th century AD, and then we see the transition to Middle English. Okay, so this is when Old English formed and then existed and was in use in this period. Now, if we were to study Old English as a language and compare it to modern English, we would notice a number of differences. First up, the alphabet. The people who spoke the Germanic languages, the Proto-Germanic or like the West and North and East Germanic languages early on, they actually had their own alphabet. They had what's known as the runic alphabet, or sometimes called Futhark runes. And they are fairly angular shapes that are used. You get shapes like this or like this, and they represent sounds, right? This is the alphabet which they develop. And so the Angles and the Saxons probably used this as well for a while. And these develop around 200 BC. We begin to see Germanic speakers using the runic alphabets. So probably even the Angles and Saxons were using this, although, again, we don't have any much evidence for Old English written in the runic alphabet because we don't have any real early examples of it. Now this changes around 700 AD. Around 700 AD, Christian missionaries introduced the Latin alphabet into England, and this is adopted for writing the Old English language. So there's a bit of an issue, though, because the Latin alphabet has been essentially modified to serve the sort of sounds that the Latin language uses, right? It has different symbols to represent all the major sounds of the Latin language. Germanic languages are a little bit different. They have some different sounds. There are some sounds they have that Latin doesn't, some sounds Latin has that Germanic languages don't have. So they need to tweak the alphabet a little bit. So for instance, they have no need for K, Z, or Q, right? Germanic speakers, they don't use those letters whatsoever. At this point, J, V, and W were not yet invented. No one had actually, those letters would be created later. So the Old English alphabet lacks K, Z, and Q because they didn't need them, J, V, and W because they didn't have them. Then they had to deal with the issue of certain sounds that they had in their language that the Latin letters did not cover. And so to cover for those, they essentially took some letters out of runic and modified them and added them to the alphabet. So for instance, Old English has this symbol. It's called thorn, and it makes a th sound. They have a similar one. It looks kind of like a D with a curvy top, and then there's a line through it. This is called eth. It also makes a th sound. They're very similar. Like I said, there wasn't a W yet, and so they used what's known as win right? And that was what they used to make their w sound. They also had a kind of a short a sound, and to distinguish that from right, and other forms of a, they have a letter called ash, right? And that stands for that sort of sound. Okay, so Old English missing some letters we would have today in English, but it had some extra letters we don't have today: thorn, win, and ash. There are also some spelling differeces, right? In the Old English period, certain sounds were spelled differently than we spell them today. So today, if we want to make the sh sound, we write sh in English. In Old English, it's sc, right? So their word for ship is right there, ship, scip. Today, if we want to make the j sound, we could use j. They didn't have that. So we might also use dg. They didn't have that either. They wrote cg. So their word for edge, for instance, is spelled ecg. That's edge in Old English. If we want to make the qu sound, we might use qu, but they don't have a q. They use cw. So their word queen, for instance, is quain, right there, cw. And then if we want to make the y sound, we use a y, but they often use a g for it. So the word year in Old English is spelled G-E-A-R, like year, but it's pronounced year. So there are some different ways of spelling things, which can also make Old English look very unfamiliar even to someone who speaks modern English. Another thing I will note is vowels. So we have, for vowels, we talk about long and short vowels as a difference in the ways you can pronounce vowels. The difference between a and a, or and e. And when we want to write a long vowel in English, sometimes we write it as two vowels, right? We can write like queen. We want to make that e long, so we double it. There are a lot of other ways to do it. We can make a diphthong, put two vowels together. There's a number of strategies. But in Old English, when they want a long vowel, they simply add a mark over the top of it. This mark's called the macron. And so when you need a long vowel, you just put a macron on top of the vowel instead of using any of those other strategies. And so it makes Old English very difficult to understand for modern English speakers, right? It's not, for those of you who have read like Shakespeare or Chaucer, that's Middle English going into modern English with Shakespeare, and it can be tough. And this is even more remote, even more different. And so it becomes a language that honestly you have to study and learn, even if you are an English speaker yourself. Another difference that we see between Old English and modern English is inflection, right? So we've been talking about inflected languages, Proto-Indo-European, Greek, Latin, they're all inflected. It means that they use endings on certain words like nouns, adjectives, and verbs to indicate grammatical properties. Now, modern English is inflected, which is why we have a difference between I run and he runs, right? That S is an ending. It tells you something. It tells you this is a third person singular. Even something like the difference between boy and boys, again, that S is an inflectional ending. It tells you something. It tells you it's plural. So we do have some, but modern English is weakly inflected. There's very few inflectional markers, especially compared to Old English. Old English had many, many more, right? It had those kinds of markers on nouns and adjectives that indicate case, gender, and number, and it had markers on verbs that indicate person, number, tense, voice, and mood, just like many other Indo-European languages. And those are now gone, right? So this is another thing that if you look at Old English, there's also going to be these endings on words. And so, it's hard to know that this word, wilaf, is actually equivalent to will, right? Because you have a difference in spelling, you have a weird letter, this is just an ending, right, an inflectional ending, so it can be hard to identify. So yeah, Old English is quite different than modern English. Okay, so that's all we're going to do in this video. In the next video, we'll talk about some of the vocabulary influences on Old English. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.